My friend, it is Dan here from projectmanaverse.com, real world technical project management for beginners. And today I'm going to explain what a project scope document is. I'll briefly explain what the purpose and what the benefit is. Then I'll spend most of the video talking about the actual document and what goes into it. So let's jump in. First of all, what is a project scope document? Well, the project scope document describes and explains what your project is delivering. That's what it is there to do. It describes everything that your project is going to do, everything that you are on the hook for delivering. So if someone just asked you, what are you doing on your project? What are you going to deliver? Just hand them the scope document and that should explain everything. That's what the document is. And before I go into the details, it's very useful for a couple of reasons, for many reasons, but I'll go into just a couple. Number one, it is the bedrock of everything you will do on your project. The scope document is the foundation of everything. Without the scope document, without the summary of what you're looking to deliver, you can't gather your requirements, you can't build a design, you can't really do anything. You can't get your comms plan together. So the scope document is the bedrock, the foundation of the whole project. So it's a really critical project, really critical document. The second thing is it's a very powerful tool because it brings clarity to the project. Now, I always say this, and I'm going to keep saying it, that a project manager's key role, or one of the project manager's key responsibilities, is bringing order from chaos. And not only bringing order from chaos, bringing clarity from the nebulous fog. Change is very chaotic and it's foggy and it's hazy. So you need to try and bring structure to that chaos and bring clarity to the nebulous fog. And this document does that. It provides that crystal clear clarity. So you and your team are very clear on what you should be delivering. There's never any doubt about if you're wasting your time on the wrong thing or the right thing. You know what your scope is. You know what you're on the hook to deliver as a project manager. There can be no doubt as to what your time should be spent on. So it's a very powerful tool to give you confidence, give you peace of mind, and give you that sense of control that you really want as a project manager, and give your team that belief that you know what you're doing and you're striving in the right direction. So that's a couple of benefits of the scope document. So let's now jump into the actual document itself. So as I say, the scope document describes in quite a lot of detail what your project is going to be delivering. It summarizes that. And it could be seen as a blanket. So everything that your project is going to do should be in this scope document. So there should be no time that you're doing something on your project that cannot be traced back to some element of the scope document. The scope document can be written in various degrees of detail. You can have a very high level one, you could have a mid-level one, you could have a really broken down detailed one. But regardless, no matter what you're doing, you should be able to trace it to some chunk of your scope document, some section of it, some element of it, some paragraph. If you can't do that, if you're doing something on your project and you can't trace it back to the scope document, then you probably should not be doing it. So just bear that in mind. So the scope document should cover everything that your project is doing. Now, not only that, what you should do in your scope document is also call out some of the key stuff that your project is not delivering. So there may be things that people may expect you to do or may assume you're going to do, and you might have a sense of what those things are because you get to know it with experience. And if you don't, you can quickly find out by asking around, asking your team, asking some of your stakeholders, getting to understand what they think you are delivering once you've had an initial conversation with them. But there'll be some things that you will not be on the hook for, or you shouldn't be, and you need to write that down in the scope document in an out of scope section of the document. Obviously, you can't write down everything that is out of scope because that list would go on forever, but you need to write down those key things that might trip you up down the line that people may be assuming that you're doing that you're not going to do, especially if someone else has to do them. And you get into that situation down the line in a big program, especially when people start to say, well, I'm not doing that, I thought you were doing it. If you have your scope document, then it's very clear. You can say, well, actually, not only is it not in my scope document, it's clearly in the out of scope section. So it covers you in that way. So recap, Scope document describes what your project is delivering. It covers everything. Anything you do on your project should be able to be traced back to some element of the scope document, and you should include in there what is out of scope as well as what is in scope. But the key out of scope stuff that people may assume that you are doing, but you're not. Okay, what else? So let's go into some examples. So a classic example, this is IT project management, technical project management. So what you're doing is generally going to be around software applications or infrastructure. So a typical project could be, we're going to upgrade some software. I use that example a lot because it's one of the most common projects you'll get out there. It's called a currency project. Usually when a software is going to go out of date and it's no longer in support by the vendor, you need to upgrade it so you keep getting the support from the vendor if it breaks down. So that's a very, very common project you'll find on in the IT world. So let's say that is your key element of scope. You're upgrading the system, but you might also be doing something with the infrastructure. You might be upgrading the database. You might be migrating the database to a new database, the cloud, for example, going onto the cloud. You might be changing the operating system. You might be doing some other infrastructure changes or upgrades. So you want to make sure all of that's covered in the scope document. That's your key tangible build elements of the scope document. So those are the key elements. But not only that, you might want to consider a few other things that will go into the scope document that are sometimes missed. And I'm going to go through some of those things now. Number one is, are you responsible for remediating or putting into place any additional controls, or amending or remediating existing controls? And controls are there to make sure that things are working correctly, that the system is working as it should be. But more so, if your system is part of a wider landscape and you've got systems upstream or downstream from it, and data is moving through this landscape, passing through your system, often you'll have controls in place. You'll have things like reconciliations to check data in point A is the same as data in point B, and it hasn't changed when it's gone through the journey traveling through that system landscape. So you want to include, this is a real one that people get tripped up on a lot, make sure you include any reconciliation, remediation, if you're on the hook for doing that, or if you're not, get it in your scope document in the in scope section or the out of scope section. That's number one. Number two is, are you going to be responsible for remediating any downstream impacts? So let's take the software example. Let's say you're upgrading the software and this current software produces some outputs. Let's say it's some outbound automated files. It will run a system, it will run a job in the system, it will spit out a file, and that file gets sent to a downstream system. Now, sometimes when you do an upgrade, that file format or what's in it will change slightly. And it might mean that the system that takes that file today that's downstream won't be able to do it. There'll be something in the file, the format, that stops it from being ingested. So are you responsible for making sure that any downstream impacts are covered for? And you probably should be, but you want to make sure that's in your scope document if you're not going to be doing that, or if you are, get it in there as well. So think about all those downstream impacts, or the potential downstream impacts. Are you responsible for them, or is that part of another project, or does someone else have to do that? And then think about the upstream impact as well. So again, your system may take files or data from a system ahead of it or upstream of it. And because of your upgrade, you may not be able to receive that data in the format that you receive it in today. So are you responsible for either ensuring that the system can take that data, or are you responsible for ensuring that the way that data is sent, the format is changed so it can be received? Or are you not responsible for either of those, and it's going to be up to the upstream system to do that work, and it's not really part of your project? That needs to be made very clear in your scope document. What else do we have? Training is another big one as well. Get that clarified at the start. Is your project responsible for doing any training? If the software is changing and you're introducing new functionality that people are going to need to be aware of, do you have to train them up? Do you have any training budget for that? If it's a very light touch thing, you might be able to get away with not real training, just a Q&A guide or something very simple, a few screenshots saying this is what's changed. But if it's more significant, you might have to do some proper training and get people in a classroom or a meeting room to go through that. So make that clear. Is training part of the scope of your project? Are you responsible for that training, or are you not? So those are the kind of things that you want to include in your scope document. Last few points I want to make on the scope document. You can also think about the basis of the scope document is all about the actual tangible thing that you're doing. So things like system upgrades or database migrations, the technical things that you're doing. But you can also think about it through different lenses. So what documentation is your project responsible for? So usually with any kind of big company, you have some kind of project management methodology, governance to go through, and you have to produce certain documentation to get through the project life cycle, like a requirements document or a scope document, this one for example, or a test plan. So in your scope document, you could capture all the documentation that you're planning to deliver as part of your project. Or if you're not going to be doing that, is it out of scope? Make sure that's all agreed up front. That's another lens you can think of it. Another lens is a testing lens. So what testing are you going to be doing on your project? Are you going to be doing just light touch testing, or are you going to go full through all the proper testing cycles, system testing, business acceptance testing, non-functional testing, all that kind of good stuff? Now, you don't have to go into too much detail about testing in the scope document because you will probably have your own master test plan, which will go into that detail later. But it's good to think about it at the start so people are aware when you start to think about what your project is doing and how much testing you really need to do in this project. How big a project is it? It helps with those kind of questions and helps you to plan the project. Okay, that is all I'm going to talk about today. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more like this one, doing daily videos. And until tomorrow, please take care.